Welcome to our screencast on trends in chordate evolution. You might be wondering, what is a chordate? Well, before I tell you what a chordate is, let me tell you what it isn't. A bug is not a chordate, worms are not chordates, and sponges aren't chordates either. So what do the remaining animals have in common? Well, these animals and many others have four main characteristics. The first is a notochord, which is a stiffened tissue on the dorsal side which helps to provide support for the animal. The second is a nerve cord. It's a bunch of nerves that help control reflexes. The third is pharyngeal gill slits. The pharynx is a muscular tube which is used for eating and breathing. So at some point, all chordates have gill slits. Some develop into gills and others develop into other things. So for example, you don't have any gills. The fourth thing that all chordates have is a tail at some point in their development. So yes, at some point you had a tail. Now we're going to get into some derived characteristics of chordates. This means that not all chordates have these. The first is a cranium. Most chordates have a cranium, which is a bony plate that helps to cover the head. Why would a chordate want to have something that covers its head? Well, the head is important because it contains brain and other sensory organs like your eyes. So your cranium helps to protect your brain if you haven't melted it away watching too much Here Comes Honey Boo Boo and Teen Mom. The next derived characteristic of chordates that we want to talk about is jaws. So some chordates have jaws, but some don't. For example, the lamprey is a jawless animal. A jaw is basically just a hinged set of bones that can open and close. It's good for biting and grasping onto things and chomping up your food. Speaking of bones, not all chordates have bones like you do. Some fish have bony skeletons, while sharks and some other chordates have skeletons that are made of cartilage. So how did we get from fish to all of the other vertebrates that we can think of? Well, in order to understand that, we need to talk about tetrapods. So no, tetrapods aren't giant Tetris pieces that walk around, although it will help you to remember what a tetrapod is. A Tetris piece is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks, and a tetrapod is an animal that can walk on 4 legs. The first tetrapods were early amphibians, which evolved from lobe-finned fish. One cool thing is this ancestor fish that was able to walk kind of on 4 legs. We call him the fishapod, and that's what he might have looked like. So now that tetrapods are able to get up and walk around on the land, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Well, because there was not much else going on land, tetrapods, the early tetrapods, were able to pretty much take up all the space they wanted. Some disadvantages, though, is that they have to stay close by to water, for many reasons. The most important is that they needed a moist breathing surface to be able to get oxygen into the blood. So instead of gills, they developed lungs. They also needed a watery environment for their embryo. So this is important for all tetrapods, but it's really important for animals that live exclusively on land. So another derived characteristic that some chordates have is an amniotic egg. The amnion is the tissue that surrounds the embryo, which helps it to keep from drying out while developing. So yes, at one point you were inside of an amniotic egg. It's important to note that amniotes are animals that exclusively lay eggs or give birth on land. The last derived characteristic that we want to talk about today is coverings. So scales, feathers, and hair are all made of the same thing, keratin. It's important to note here that we're talking about dry scales. So the scales that you find on reptiles are different than the scales on fish, and we're talking about reptile scales here. But scales, feathers, and hair are all made of the same thing, which means that feathers are really just modified scales. Before you exit out of this screencast, make sure you've done the following. Make sure you took notes while you were watching the screencast, that you went back and re-listened to any parts that were confusing to you, and that if you still have questions, you contacted your teacher.